Did you hear the sirens before you heard the news? Because some people did. They say it started as a whisper, not a headline, not a breaking news banner screaming across a screen. A whisper, a phone vibrating in the dark, a voice on the other end that didn't sound real. Too calm, too careful, the kind of voice that only shows up when something has already gone terribly wrong. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if I told you that, for a brief and terrifying window of time, the most powerful family in Britain believed they were about to lose Prince Harry? Not metaphorically, not politically, not emotionally. Lose him. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't just about a car crash. It wasn't just about twisted metal or flashing lights or emergency rooms sealed behind glass doors. It was about something far older, far heavier, and far more dangerous than any accident on a road. It was about regret, about years of silence, about words never said, calls never returned, and a family that suddenly realized time might have run out. Ask yourself this before we go any further. How do you prepare for the moment you always assumed you'd have more time to fix? Because on this night, there were no prepared statements, no polished smiles, no rehearsed calm. There was panic, there was disbelief, and behind palace walls, there were tears, real ones. The first reports didn't make sense. That's how these stories always begin. Conflicting timelines, vague language, carefully chosen phrases that raise more questions than they answer. A minor incident, a brief hospital visit, nothing to worry about. Please respect privacy. But privacy doesn't ask to be respected when fear is this loud. And fear was everywhere. Picture it. Late evening, phones lighting up in rooms that should have been quiet. Staff moving faster than usual, but speaking softer than ever. Doors closing, curtains drawn, decisions being made without consensus, without certainty, without comfort. Somewhere, on a road that would soon be scrutinized down to the smallest detail, a moment had already passed. A moment that couldn't be undone. A moment that set everything else into motion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Car crashes happen every day. Most of them don't change the course of history. Most of them don't leave kings staring at walls in silence or brothers frozen between anger and fear. So why did this one feel different? Because this wasn't just a man in a car. This was a son who had walked away, a brother who had spoken out, a prince who had carried grief since childhood and never quite put it down. And in that instant, all of it came rushing back. You could feel it in the way the story was being handled. The pauses, the delays, the absence of images, the lack of the usual choreography. This wasn't a media strategy yet. This was a family scrambling to understand what they were dealing with. Was he conscious? Was he alone? How bad was it? Questions stacking on top of questions, none of them with answers that felt solid enough to hold on to. And then came the most chilling detail. Not the crash itself, not the location, not even the timing. It was the reaction. Because when the news reached certain members of the family, it didn't sound like outrage or frustration or even surprise. It sounded like fear. The kind of fear that only shows up when the stakes are deeply personal. When titles don't matter. When cameras don't matter. When the past suddenly feels heavier than the present. People close to the situation would later describe the mood with a single word. Fragile. Every movement felt fragile. Every decision felt fragile. Even the truth itself felt fragile, like it might shatter if spoken too loudly. And in the middle of all of this, one phrase began to circulate quietly, almost accidentally. Not meant for public ears. Not meant to be repeated. We are losing him. Think about that for a second. Not this looks bad. Not how will this play. Not what will people say. We are losing him. That's not a headline. That's a confession. And confessions rarely come from strength. They come from fear. From helplessness. From the realization that control has slipped through your fingers. This is where the story stops being about a crash and starts being about a family. A family that has spent years communicating through intermediaries, through statements, through interviews, through carefully constructed distance. A family that believed, perhaps foolishly, that there would always be time to fix things later. Later is a dangerous word. Later assumes certainty. Later assumes survival. Later assumes tomorrow is guaranteed. But on this night, later disappeared. The hours that followed were not dramatic in the way movies portray crisis. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations, just waiting. Endless, unbearable waiting. Waiting for updates that didn't come fast enough. Waiting for phones to ring. Waiting for someone, anyone, to say something definitive. And in that waiting, memories began to surface. Not by choice, by force. A boy walking behind a coffin. A young man trying to outrun his past. A grown man choosing distance because closeness hurt too much. Grief has a way of stacking itself, one layer on top of another, year after year, until something cracks and everything underneath spills out at once. That's what this moment threatened to do. Because if the worst happened, there would be no undoing it. No apologies. No late-night phone calls. No private reconciliations away from cameras. Just headlines. Just history. Just silence. And here's the cruel irony. For years, the world debated Prince Harry as a symbol. A rebel. A victim. A troublemaker. A truth-teller. A liability. A headline generator. But in these hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was the simplest, most terrifying question of all. Would he be okay? And the answer, at least for a while, was unclear. Information moved slowly. Too slowly. Some people knew more than others. Some were kept deliberately in the dark. Not out of malice, but out of fear of causing panic. But panic has a way of finding its own path. One person, in particular, struggled with the silence. Someone who had spent years holding on to anger like armor. Someone who had convinced himself that distance was safer than vulnerability. Because distance doesn't hurt as much. Until it does. And when it does, it hits all at once. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't protocol anymore. This wasn't about hierarchy. This was about blood. About a father who had already lost so much. About a brother haunted by the idea that pride might have stolen his last chance. About a woman known for composure who could no longer keep the tears back. And still, the public knew almost nothing. Just enough to worry. Just enough to speculate. Just enough to feel that something was being carefully held back. And maybe it was. Because not every story is meant to be told immediately. Some moments are too raw. Too dangerous. Too revealing. Some truths change everything the moment they're spoken. As the night stretched on, a decision was made behind closed doors. A decision that would shape the hours to come. A decision driven not by strategy, but by fear and love and regret colliding all at once. It wasn't written down. It wasn't announced. But it mattered. And the consequences of that decision would ripple outward in ways no one could yet predict. Because the crash was only the beginning. The real impact was still coming. And the next update wouldn't come from a spokesperson. It would come from a moment that forced this family to confront everything they'd been avoiding. What happens in the minutes after impact? Not the cinematic version. Not the slow-motion chaos people imagine. The real version is quieter, more confusing, and far more unsettling. Because after the sound, after the jolt, after the moment where your body realizes something has gone wrong, there's a pause. A strange, suspended pause where the world hasn't caught up yet, where consequences haven't fully arrived, where everything still feels reversible. That pause is where this story truly begins. The road was not dramatic. No sweeping curves meant to intimidate. No obvious danger screaming for attention. That's what makes it unsettling. Accidents that change lives rarely announce themselves in advance. They slip in quietly, pretending to be ordinary until they aren't. Somewhere along that stretch of asphalt, a routine moment fractured. Not just metal, not just plans. History. Here's what we know and what we don't. Early descriptions used language that sounded harmless on the surface. Words like incident, collision, assessed. These are the words chosen when people don't yet understand the gravity of what they're describing, or when they do understand it and are desperately trying to keep it contained. But even then, the contradictions started to appear. Timing didn't line up. Accounts shifted. One source insisted everything was under control. Another went strangely quiet. And silence, in situations like this, is never neutral. Ask yourself something. If everything was truly fine, why the delay? Why the careful pacing of information? Why the sudden tightening of access? Those questions weren't being asked publicly yet, but behind closed doors, they were already echoing. Inside the vehicle, the immediate aftermath was not panic. It was disorientation, the kind that makes you question your own senses, the kind that forces you to inventory yourself, piece by piece, trying to understand what just happened. Can I move? Can I breathe? Is anyone else hurt? These aren't dramatic thoughts. They're primal ones. And they don't wait for permission. Emergency services arrive quickly. Too quickly for speculation, some would later argue. Not quickly enough for reassurance. Lights cut through the darkness, turning an ordinary night into something surreal. Red, blue, white. Reflections bouncing off metal, off glass, off faces that were suddenly far too serious. But here's the part that still doesn't sit right. Witnesses would later describe the scene as controlled, almost subdued. No shouting, no frenzy, just efficiency, the kind that suggests people understood the importance of who they were dealing with. Because anonymity vanished the moment identification was made. From that second on, this wasn't just an accident. It was a situation. And situations involving powerful families have gravity. They bend behavior. They alter procedures. They change the way information flows. Some decisions were made instantly. Others were delayed, perhaps intentionally. And those delays would become the first cracks in the official narrative. The transfer to medical care happened swiftly, but quietly. No spectacle. No convoy screaming through streets. That absence would later raise eyebrows. Because when urgency meets restraint, it often means uncertainty. Uncertainty is dangerous, especially when it involves someone whose life has already been shaped by tragedy on the road. You don't need to say her name to feel the weight of it. Everyone felt it. It hung over the scene like an unspoken fear, a ghost nobody wanted to acknowledge. History has a way of whispering at the worst possible times. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere shifted again. Hospitals are strange places. They're designed for healing, but they're steeped in fear. Every corridor carries stories of relief and loss, often side by side. That night, certain corridors were cleared faster than usual. Certain doors were closed. Certain staff were instructed to say less than they knew. Not because of secrecy alone, because of caution, because information, once released, cannot be pulled back. And at this stage, nothing was certain enough to release. Initial assessments raised concerns, then downplayed them, then raised them again. The kind of back and forth that makes your stomach drop, even if no one is saying the words you're afraid to hear. Stable can mean many things. So can precautionary. So can under observation. Those phrases sound comforting, until you realize how wide their definitions really are. Meanwhile, messages were being drafted and erased. Calls were being placed and redirected. Advisors were waking people who did not want to be woken this way. And somewhere, a father was being prepared for a conversation no parent ever wants. But preparation can only do so much. The call itself was brief. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying too much would have made it real too quickly. There is a moment, when delivering bad news, where you watch someone's face change before they speak, before they ask questions, before they react. That moment happened behind palace walls, unseen by cameras, undocumented by history books. And it changed the temperature of the room. Because this wasn't abstract. This wasn't about public perception. This was about a son whose relationship with his family had been complicated, strained, and unfinished. Unfinished is the word that haunted the night. Unfinished conversations. Unfinished forgiveness. Unfinished anger. Unfinished love. Staff would later describe the atmosphere as heavy, but that doesn't capture it. Heavy suggests weight alone. This was weight mixed with urgency, regret, and the creeping realization that time might be dictating terms now. And time, when it takes control, is unforgiving. As updates trickled in, they created more questions than answers. One report suggested improvement. Another hinted at concern. Another went silent altogether. Silence again. And then there was the issue of who knew what and when. Because not everyone was informed at the same time. Some people found out through official channels. Others heard through whispers. A few learned indirectly, the worst possible way, through sudden shifts in behavior that told them something was very wrong. One person, in particular, noticed the change immediately. A brother who had spent years convincing himself that distance was necessary. That emotional separation was survival. That anger was safer than vulnerability. But anger doesn't protect you from fear. It amplifies it. When the message finally reached him, it didn't land all at once. It came in pieces, fragments that didn't yet form a full picture. And that partial understanding was almost worse. Because imagination fills gaps mercilessly. He didn't ask many questions at first. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of the answers. afraid of confirming something he wasn't ready to face. Think about that for a moment. How many people live their lives assuming there will be a right time to fix things later? Later when it's calmer. Later when emotions aren't so raw. Later when pride doesn't stand in the way. Later is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. That night, later collapsed. As hours passed, the narrative outside remained tightly controlled. No dramatic statements. No definitive reassurances. Just enough information to acknowledge something had happened, and not enough to explain what it meant. That balance is intentional. It buys time, but it also breeds speculation. Inside the family, the balance was different. There was no controlling the emotional narrative. Reactions were raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. A mother figure who had always believed in healing over conflict struggled to keep her composure. Not because she feared the public reaction, but because she feared the personal cost. A father, already burdened by years of responsibility and loss, found himself confronting the most powerless role of all, parent, because no title shields you from that fear. And still, one crucial decision remained unresolved: whether to wait, or whether to move, whether to keep distance, as protocol demanded, or whether to break it, consequences be damned. That decision would not be made lightly. It would be argued quietly, weighed emotionally, justified in whispers, because once crossed, certain lines can never be uncrossed. And somewhere in that debate, a phrase slipped out, not intended for repetition, not intended for history, just an honest, unguarded admission spoken in fear. We are losing him. It wasn't a diagnosis. It wasn't a certainty. It was a feeling. And feelings, when shared in moments like this, reveal more than facts ever could. Because that phrase didn't mean death. It meant something else entirely. It meant losing him emotionally, losing the chance to reconcile, losing the opportunity to make things right, losing the version of the future they had all assumed would be available indefinitely. That realization changed everything, and it set into motion a choice that would alter the course of the night, a choice that would bring people together who hadn't stood in the same emotional space for years, a choice that would force old wounds open in the name of something more important. But before that choice could be acted on, something unexpected happened. An update arrived, not from a spokesperson, not from an advisor, from someone inside the hospital who wasn't supposed to speak yet. And that update would turn quiet fear into urgent action. Because the situation was no longer theoretical. It was moving, and time, once again, was not on their side. What if the update you're waiting for is the one you're least prepared to hear? Because when it came, it didn't arrive with sirens or ceremony. It arrived quietly, too quietly. A message passed from one person to another, stripped of emotion, reduced to essentials. The kind of update that doesn't tell you everything, but tells you enough to change your posture, your breathing, your priorities. He's asking questions. That was it. Not a diagnosis. Not a prognosis. Just 4 words that detonated inside the room. He's asking questions. On the surface, that sounds reassuring. Conscious. Aware. Present. But beneath it, something else lurked. Because the questions he was asking weren't simple ones. They weren't about pain or comfort or logistics. They were about people. About timing. About things left unsaid. And that's when the tone shifted from waiting to urgency. You have to understand what that meant in context. This wasn't a man waking up confused and groggy. This was someone whose mind, even under stress, went straight to relationships. Straight to the fault lines that had defined his adult life. Who knows? Have they been told? Is he coming? Those kinds of questions don't come from someone detached from reality. They come from someone acutely aware that time matters. And suddenly, the idea of waiting felt reckless. Inside the palace, the debate intensified. Advisors urged caution. Protocol exists for a reason, they said. Appearances matter. Timing matters. Optics matter. But fear has a way of stripping language down to its core. This isn't about optics. That was the response. This is about family. For years, decisions had been filtered through layers of consideration. What would this look like? How would this play? What precedent would it set? But that night, precedent felt irrelevant. Because if the unthinkable happened, no one wanted to look back and realize they'd chosen restraint over connection. The irony is painful. The same system designed to protect the family from chaos had, over time, created distance so vast it now threatened to cost them something irreplaceable. And in the center of that tension stood a father. Not a king, a father. A man who had watched one son pull away, not out of cruelty. This wasn't a casual visit. This wasn't a courtesy appearance. This was a crossing of emotional borders that had been reinforced for years. Once crossed, they wouldn't magically reseal themselves. You can't unsee vulnerability. You can't unhear regret. And you can't walk back from showing up when it matters most. One person hesitated longer than the others. Not out of indifference, out of fear. Because fear doesn't always look like running away. Sometimes it looks like standing still, unable to decide which step will hurt less. He stood there longer than anyone realized, alone with his thoughts, alone with the version of himself he'd spent years constructing. The composed one, the controlled one, the one who never let the cracks show. That version didn't know how to walk into a hospital room and admit that silence had been a mistake. It's easier to be angry than vulnerable, easier to argue than to apologize, easier to keep distance than to risk rejection. But fear has a way of stripping away your preferred coping mechanisms. Because fear asks one brutal question: what if this is the last chance? And suddenly, all the arguments you've rehearsed over the years sound hollow. All the justifications lose their weight. All the reasons you told yourself feel embarrassingly small compared to the stakes in front of you. So he moved. Not confidently, not dramatically, just enough. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. No one spoke unless necessary. No music. No distractions. Just the sound of tires on pavement and thoughts no one wanted to articulate out loud. Every mile felt longer than the last. Inside the hospital, preparations were made with careful discretion. Staff were briefed. Access was restricted, not out of secrecy alone, but out of respect for the volatility of the moment. Because emotions were fragile on both sides of the door. Prince Harry knew they were coming before anyone told him. He sensed it, not through an announcement or a confirmation, but through the subtle shifts around him. The way people spoke more carefully. The way time seemed to slow. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain. Something else. Anticipation. Fear. Hope. All tangled together. This was the moment he'd replayed in his mind more times than he cared to admit. Usually in frustration. Sometimes in anger. Occasionally in sadness. Rarely in hope. He had imagined confrontations. Arguments. Cold exchanges. Awkward silences. He had not imagined this. Because imagination rarely prepares you for vulnerability. It prefers drama, conflict, control. This moment offered none of that. Just uncertainty. As footsteps approached, his mind raced. What do I say first? Do I joke? Do I apologize? Do I pretend everything is fine? Pretending had gotten him here. He didn't want to pretend anymore. The door opened slowly. Not because anyone was trying to be dramatic, but because no one wanted to rush this. The air shifted. You can feel moments like that. The kind that change relationships forever, no matter how they end. The kind where history seems to lean in, watching. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Eyes met. And in that silence, years of distance collapsed into a single, overwhelming truth. They had all been hurting. In different ways. For different reasons. But hurting nonetheless. There was no grand speech. No rehearsed apology. Just a step forward. A pause. A breath that caught unexpectedly. Sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones stripped of language. A father's face, older than the last time they'd seen each other up close. More lined. More fragile. The weight of responsibility etched deeper than before. A brother's posture, tense but uncertain. Defensive instincts battling something softer. Something he'd kept buried for too long. And Harry, lying there, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Not physically, emotionally. This wasn't the battlefield any of them had prepared for. This was something else entirely. Words came slowly at first, cautiously, as if everyone was afraid of breaking the fragile equilibrium. How are you feeling? A simple question, loaded with everything it didn't say. Harry answered honestly, not with bravado, not with deflection, just honesty. That honesty cracked something open. Because honesty invites honesty in return. A hand reached out, hesitant, not sure if it would be accepted. It was. And just like that, the emotional distance that had seemed insurmountable suddenly felt thinner. Not gone, but thinner. Do you know how rare that is? For years of tension to soften, even slightly, in a single moment? It doesn't mean everything is fixed. It means something has shifted. Time passed strangely in that room. Minutes stretched, hours compressed. Conversation drifted from surface-level updates to deeper admissions. Things that had been swallowed out of pride resurfaced. Things that had been misunderstood were clarified. Not everything, not even most things, but enough. Enough to change the tone. Enough to make the fear feel shared instead of isolated. And then, inevitably, the conversation turned to the accident itself. Not the mechanics, not the details, the meaning, because accidents have a way of forcing reflection. Harry spoke quietly about how quickly everything had changed, about how fragile certainty suddenly felt, about how the future he'd assumed would be there had nearly vanished in an instant. Listening to him was harder than anyone expected, because it meant confronting the possibility of loss in a way that no headline ever could. And then came the question no one had planned for, the one that shifted the room again. What happens after this? Not medically, emotionally, relationally. What happens when the crisis ends? Do they retreat back into distance? Do they pretend this moment never happened? Or does something real come out of it? No one answered right away, because that question has no easy response, especially when the outside world is waiting, watching, ready to interpret every move, every word, every silence. That pressure crept back in slowly, the awareness that this private moment would eventually collide with public reality. Statements would have to be made. Timelines explained. Absence is justified. And with that collision came risk, because vulnerability does not survive well under scrutiny. As the visit drew toward its end, something subtle but significant happened. A promise was implied, not spoken outright, just understood, that this wouldn't be the last conversation. That waiting for later was no longer an option. That whatever happened next, it would be faced with more honesty than before. But promises made in crisis are fragile. They depend on what comes next. And what came next was uncertain. Because just as the room began to exhale, just as relief started to edge out fear, another update arrived. This one different. This one less ambiguous. This one carrying consequences no one had fully prepared for. A development that would force the family to confront not just the accident, but everything that followed it. And in that moment, it became clear. The hardest part of this story wasn't behind them. It was just beginning. What happens when relief arrives too early? Because that's the trap everyone fell into. For a brief window, it felt like the worst had passed. Not because everything was suddenly fine, but because fear had loosened its grip just enough to let people breathe again. Conversations softened. Shoulders dropped. The tension that had been coiled tight for hours began to unwind. That's when people make mistakes. That's when they assume the danger is over. The update that arrived next did not undo the relief immediately. It complicated it. It came wrapped in cautious language, delivered by someone who chose their words with surgical precision. There are concerns, not panic-inducing concerns, not catastrophic ones. The kind that sound manageable if you don't look too closely. The kind that invite optimism while quietly demanding vigilance. But concerns mean uncertainty, and uncertainty means this story wasn't done with them yet. The room shifted again, though more subtly this time. No gasps, no raised voices, just a recalibration, a collective understanding that this wasn't a straight line toward resolution. It was a winding path with blind corners. One step forward, half a step back. Doctors explained what they could without committing to what they couldn't guarantee. They used careful phrasing. They emphasized monitoring. They talked about time as if it were both ally and threat. Time will tell. Time again. That phrase lingered in the air like a challenge, because time had already proven itself unreliable. Outside the room, advisors were already thinking ahead, not because they wanted to intrude, but because this situation had layers. Emotional, familial, public, all intertwined. Sooner or later, the world would notice the shifts, the altered schedules, the unusual silences, the faces that appeared tired in ways makeup couldn't hide. And when the world noticed, it would ask questions. Questions that demanded answers. Answers that might complicate the fragile progress that had just been made. Inside, the family faced a dilemma that felt both cruel and unavoidable. How do you protect a moment of honesty from a system that feeds on exposure? Because once this story reached the outside world in full, it wouldn't belong to them anymore. It would be dissected, interpreted, argued over. Every gesture would be analyzed. Every absence explained away or weaponized. Even sincerity would be questioned, especially sincerity. As the visit came to its natural close, there was reluctance in the air. Not dramatic reluctance. The quiet kind. The kind where no one wants to be the first to say it's time. But time was moving, whether they acknowledged it or not. They said their goodbyes carefully. Not final. Not definitive. Just for now. Those words matter. For now. Because they carry hope. But they also carry risk. As doors closed and footsteps faded, the room felt emptier than before. Not lonelier. Just quieter. As if the intensity of connection had briefly filled the space and then withdrawn, leaving an echo behind. Harry lay back, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. Emotional vulnerability takes its own toll. It drains you differently, leaves you hollowed out and raw. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the visit in his mind. Not looking for mistakes, looking for meaning. Had it mattered? Would it last? Or would it dissolve once the crisis passed? Those questions didn't have answers yet, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any injury. Elsewhere, the family dispersed with thoughts heavier than when they'd arrived. Relief mixed with guilt, hope tangled with fear, the knowledge that they had come closer to something precious and nearly lost it. Near Mrs. Leavemark's, too, they returned to their roles slowly. Not fully, not convincingly. You could feel the difference if you knew what to look for. The outside world began to stir. Subtle shifts in coverage. A careful uptick in attention. Rumors began to circulate, fueled by the absence of clarity. Speculation filled the gaps that silence left behind. And silence, at this stage, was intentional. Because speaking too soon risked undoing everything. But waiting too long risked something else. Control. In situations like this, information behaves like water. It finds cracks. It seeps. It flows where it's not wanted. Someone, somewhere would talk. Not out of malice. Out of pressure. Out of fear. Out of the belief that sharing might help. And when that happened, the narrative would shift again. Because narratives don't just reflect events. They shape them. Behind the scenes, conversations resumed. Not emotional ones this time. Strategic ones. How to respond if asked. What to confirm. What to deny. What to leave unanswered. Each option carried consequences. Confirm too much, and you invite scrutiny. Deny too much, and you invite suspicion. Say nothing, and you let others speak for you. It's a delicate balance. One the family had learned to navigate over decades. But this situation was different. Because at its core, it wasn't about image. It was about trust. Trust between people who had allowed it to erode over time. Trust that had been tentatively rebuilt in a hospital room under the shadow of loss. Would that trust survive exposure? That was the real question now. And as if on cue, the first crack appeared. A detail emerged that hadn't been part of the official flow. A small thing, easily dismissed. But small things have a way of growing when they don't align with expectations. A timing discrepancy. A location question. A report that didn't quite match what had been implied earlier. It wasn't explosive. Not yet. But it was enough to shift the tone. Enough to remind everyone that control is an illusion. Because once the story escapes private hands, it becomes something else entirely. Harry sensed the change before anyone told him. Again, not through words, but through atmosphere. The way conversations stopped when he entered. The way reassurances sounded slightly rehearsed. He didn't push. He didn't ask. But the unease settled in his chest. He had lived this before. He knew what came next. The slow build. The careful leaks. The questions framed as concern. The concern framed as doubt. And doubt framed as judgment. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. This wasn't what he wanted. He had hoped the accident might act as a pause button. A moment of grace before the noise resumed. But the noise was already warming up. And then, finally, someone said it out loud. There's something you should know. Those words rarely lead anywhere good. They were spoken carefully, gently, but they carried weight. Because what followed wasn't just about health or recovery. It was about the story itself. About how it would be told. About who would be believed. About what would be questioned. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. Because the next phase of this ordeal wasn't happening in a hospital room. It was happening in public. And public moments don't wait for healing. They demand answers. What happens when the story leaves the room? Because the moment it does, it stops belonging to you. The first sign wasn't a headline. It was a tone shift. The kind you only notice if you've lived through it before. A subtle change in phrasing. A careful insertion of words like reportedly and sources suggest, language that pretends to be neutral while quietly opening the door to speculation. That's when Harry knew. The pause had ended. The outside world was stepping in. At first, it moved slowly. A ripple, not a wave. Commentators expressing concern without saying much of anything. Experts filling airtime by repeating the same cautious phrases. Social media oscillating between sympathy and suspicion because it always does. But beneath that surface calm, something else was forming. A narrative. And narratives are dangerous when they're built without full information, because they don't wait for facts. They assemble themselves around fragments, assumptions, and emotional cues. They favor what feels right over what is right. And this story, loaded with history and symbolism, was especially vulnerable to that kind of distortion. Inside the hospital, updates continued. Incremental, technical, meant for internal reassurance rather than public consumption. Each one offered a little clarity while introducing new questions. Progress, but not resolution. Improvement, but not certainty. Those qualifiers matter, because they create space. And space is where interpretation thrives. Advisors began to push again. Not aggressively, carefully. They suggested preparing statements, drafting contingencies, planning for questions that hadn't been asked yet, but soon would be. The idea wasn't to mislead. It was to manage expectations. But managing expectations requires alignment. And alignment was fragile right now, because something had changed emotionally that no statement could capture. That visit, that moment, the connection forged under pressure. How do you translate that into a press release? You can't. And if you try, it sounds hollow. Harry sensed the tension tightening around him again. Not because people were acting coldly, but because they were acting carefully. Carefully is often worse. It means something is being held back. He wanted to ask what was happening, wanted clarity, wanted honesty, but he hesitated, because asking would force answers, and answers would bring the noise crashing back in full force. So he waited. Waiting had become familiar. Elsewhere, the family was grappling with their own version of the same dilemma. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, shown up when it mattered, opened a door that had been sealed shut for years. That choice felt right, but it also felt exposed, because now the world would want to know why this moment mattered, why it was different, why now? And once those questions started, they wouldn't stop at the surface. They would dig into old wounds, old interviews, old grievances. They would frame this moment not as a human reckoning, but as a narrative pivot. Was this reconciliation? Was it strategic? Was it performative? Those questions are brutal, not because they're malicious, but because they reduce something deeply personal into a spectacle. And spectacle strips away nuance. As speculation built, one detail began to circulate more persistently than the others. A detail that didn't fit neatly into the emerging story. The timing. It didn't quite add up. When exactly did the accident happen? When exactly was help summoned? When exactly were certain people informed? These questions, innocuous on their own, started to stack. Not enough to accuse, just enough to doubt. And doubt, once seated, is hard to uproot. Harry felt the shift before it was spelled out to him. He had learned to read the signs. The careful avoidance of eye contact. The way conversations changed when he entered the room. Finally, someone sat down beside him. Not standing. Sitting. That posture alone signaled seriousness. They spoke calmly, professionally, with empathy. They explained that there were inconsistencies being noticed outside, that questions were being raised, that nothing overtly hostile had surfaced yet, but the trajectory was familiar. This is gaining attention. Those words landed heavily, not because attention itself was new, but because of what it would inevitably bring with it. Scrutiny, interpretation, judgment. Harry closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. He had hoped this moment would be different, that the accident might create a pause long enough for humanity to take precedence over narrative. But humanity doesn't trend. Stories do. He asked a simple question. What are they saying? The answer was careful. Concern, sympathy, curiosity, and underneath it all, an unspoken tension. Because the public didn't just want to know if he was okay. They wanted to know what this meant. For the family. For the future. For the fractures that had defined them for so long. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another conversation was unfolding. One that had nothing to do with statements or optics. It was about trust. Because once a story leaves private hands, Someone has to decide how much truth to let out and when. Too little, and you look evasive. Too much, and you lose control entirely. This family had lived that paradox for generations. But this time, the stakes felt different. Because this was theirs. And he had just felt, in that hospital room, how fragile their connection still was. How tentative. How easily it could be strained again. If he spoke too openly, he risked pulling them back into a narrative they hadn't asked for. If he stayed silent, he risked allowing that narrative to shape itself without him. It felt like being asked to choose which wound would hurt less. Outside, the noise continued to build. A commentator suggested that the accident might have been more serious than initially indicated. Another hinted that the response time raised questions. Someone else brought up history. Old patterns. Old controversies. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The past was being pulled into the present, and the present was starting to look like a repeat. Inside the family, the strain was palpable, not because they disagreed about caring, but because they disagreed about strategy. Some believed openness would defuse speculation, that honesty, even when uncomfortable, was the best path forward. Others feared that openness would be exploited, that vulnerability would be twisted into weakness, that once the door was opened, it would never close. Both sides had evidence to support their view. That was the problem. Experience had taught them all hard lessons. Harry listened more than he spoke, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he was weighing something deeper. Trust. Trust in the people around him. Trust in the public. Trust in himself. He thought about the moment in the hospital room, the look on his father's face, the tension in his brother's posture, the unspoken promise that this wouldn't be wasted. Would staying silent honor that moment, or would it undermine it? He didn't know, and not knowing gnawed at him. The next development came quietly, but it landed hard. A request, not from the press, from someone closer. A suggestion that he consider addressing the situation personally, not in detail, not defensively, but emotionally, to speak not about the accident, but about the aftermath, the gratitude, the perspective, the reminder of what matters. The idea made sense. It also terrified him, because once you speak emotionally, you invite interpretation. You open yourself up to having your words dissected, reframed, and used in ways you never intended. But you also reclaim some agency. You stop being purely reactive. That possibility lingered. As night approached again, the sense of urgency sharpened. Silence was no longer just a choice. It was becoming a liability. Harry felt the pressure building, but he also felt something else. Resolve. Not the loud, performative kind. The quiet kind that comes when you realize avoidance is no longer an option. He asked for time. A little more. Time to think. Time to feel. Time to decide how to move forward without betraying the moment that had brought them all together. But time was running out. Because even as he deliberated, another thread of the story was gaining traction. A detail from the accident itself, resurfacing in a way that demanded attention. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. But it was persistent. And persistence is how stories harden. Someone had noticed something that didn't align with earlier descriptions. A minor inconsistency, dismissed at first, now being repeated often enough to feel significant. The location, the sequence, the response, enough to spark questions that could no longer be brushed aside. Harry was informed gently, carefully, but the implication was clear. This is becoming harder to contain. He nodded, absorbing the information. Inside, a familiar mix of emotions stirred. Frustration, fatigue, determination. He had spent years feeling like his voice was either ignored or weaponized, years oscillating between speaking out and pulling back. This moment demanded a different approach, but finding it felt like navigating without a map. He closed his eyes and thought back to the accident, the suddenness, the way it had stripped away layers of distraction and ego. In that clarity, one truth stood out. He didn't want this to become another story about division. He didn't want to look back and see another missed opportunity. And he didn't want the people he loved to feel like they had once again been dragged into chaos without purpose. That realization didn't give him an answer, but it narrowed the field. As dawn approached, the decision point loomed closer. Messages waited unanswered. Drafts sat unfinished. People hovered, careful not to push too hard. Everyone sensed it. Something was about to happen. Whether he spoke or remained silent, The next move would define the tone of everything that followed. And the world, restless and impatient, was already leaning forward, waiting. What if the decision you make isn't about what you say, but when you say it? Because timing, Harry knew, could change everything. The room was quiet in that peculiar way that only exists when people are waiting on one person to speak. Not asking, not pushing, just hovering in a respectful, almost anxious orbit. Phones lay face down. Laptops closed. Draft statements paused mid-sentence, like breaths being held. Harry sat there, feeling the weight of all of it press against his chest. Not physically. Something heavier. Something familiar. Expectation. For most of his life, expectation had been a constant companion. Sometimes it wore the shape of duty. Sometimes defiance. Sometimes resentment. And sometimes, like now, it arrived disguised as concern. Everyone wanted to protect him. Everyone wanted to protect the family. Everyone wanted to protect the story. But those three goals did not align as neatly as they pretended to. He broke the silence with a question that caught people off guard. What happens if I wait? The answers came slowly. Waiting might allow things to settle. Waiting might let recovery take center stage. Waiting might also allow speculation to metastasize. The truth sat uncomfortably in the middle. Waiting wasn't neutral anymore. It was a gamble. And gambles, Harry had learned, rarely favor the person with the most to lose. He leaned back, staring at a point on the wall that didn't matter. His mind drifted, uninvited, to earlier chapters of his life. Moments when he'd spoken too quickly. Moments when he'd waited too long. Moments when his words had been used to define him in ways he hadn't intended. That was the paradox. Speak and lose control. Stay silent and lose control anyway. Somewhere between those two outcomes, there had to be another path. The idea that had been floated earlier returned to the surface. Not a detailed explanation. Not a defensive rebuttal. Something simpler. More human. An acknowledgement. A recognition of how close things had come. A reminder of what mattered. It wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. He asked another question, softer this time. If I say something, who does it affect most? No one answered immediately. Because everyone knew the answer. It wouldn't just affect him. It would affect his father, already walking a tightrope between private fear and public responsibility. It would affect his brother, who had only just stepped into emotional territory he'd spent years avoiding. It would affect a family that had finally, briefly, met each other without intermediaries or agendas. And once again, Harry felt that pull between independence and connection. The tension that had defined so much of his adult life. He didn't want to hurt them, but he also didn't want to let the moment evaporate under the weight of silence. As discussions paused, Harry was left alone again. Not physically, but internally. He thought back to the accident itself. The suddenness. The clarity that followed. The way it had stripped away distractions and forced him to confront the reality of how fragile everything was. That clarity hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened. He realized something then that surprised even him. This wasn't about control. It was about honesty. Not the kind that lists facts and timelines. The kind that admits fear. That admission changed how the decision felt. Because honesty, while risky, was something he could live with. Control had always been an illusion. He stood, slowly, feeling the room's attention shift instantly. He didn't make a speech. He didn't announce a decision. He simply said he needed to write something himself. That alone said enough. The room emptied quietly, leaving him with space and time. Two things that had felt scarce since the accident. He sat down and stared at the blank screen in front of him. No prompts. No talking points. No approved language. Just him. The first few minutes were the hardest. His fingers hovered over the keys, paralyzed by the knowledge that once words existed, they could not be unmade. He typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Everything sounded wrong. Too stiff. Too careful. Too much like the voice people expected instead of the one he actually had. He stopped trying to sound right. He started trying to sound true. The words came more easily then. Not quickly, but honestly. He wrote about perspective. About how quickly life can change. About gratitude for the people who show up when things matter. He avoided specifics. Not because he was hiding, but because specifics weren't the point. The point was meaning. As he wrote, something unexpected happened. The tension in his chest eased. Not completely, but enough to remind him why he was doing this. He wasn't trying to manage a narrative. He He was trying to honor a moment. When he finished, he didn't send it right away. He read it again, out loud, listening for anything that felt performative or defensive. There was none of that, just vulnerability. That scared him more than anything else, because vulnerability invites interpretation, and interpretation can be brutal. Still, he knew this was the right step. He shared the draft with a small circle. No debates, no rewrites, just quiet reading. The reactions were telling. No one asked to change the tone. No one suggested softening anything. That silence felt like approval, or at least respect. As preparations were made to release the statement, Harry felt a familiar unease settle in. Not doubt, anticipation. Once this went out, the story would move again, possibly in directions he couldn't predict, but at least it would move on terms that felt more authentic. The message was released without fanfare. No dramatic announcement. No build-up. Just words. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the responses began to trickle in. Not the loud ones. The quiet ones. Messages from people who said they felt it. Who said it sounded real. Who said it reminded them of what mattered in their own lives. That reaction surprised Harry more than anything else, because it suggested something he'd nearly forgotten. Not everyone is looking for a fight. Not everyone wants to tear things apart. Some people just want to understand. But understanding never lasts long in the public sphere. Within hours, analysis followed. What does this mean? What doesn't it say? Why now? Why this tone? Some praised it. Others questioned it. A few dismissed it as calculated. Harry expected that. What he didn't expect was how the family would react. The response wasn't public. It was personal. A message. Short. Uncomplicated. Thank you. 2 words. But they carried weight. Because they acknowledged effort. And effort, after years of distance, meant something. For the first time since the accident, Harry felt something close to cautious optimism. Not relief. Not resolution. Just the sense that a different path might be possible. But optimism, like everything else in this story, was fragile. Because even as the statement softened some of the noise, it intensified another kind of attention. The focus began to shift. From what Harry said, to what he didn't. And what he didn't say was becoming its own story. Questions resurfaced about the accident itself. Renewed curiosity. Fresh angles. The statement hadn't closed the door. It had simply redirected attention. And now, the redirected attention was gaining momentum. Late that evening, another update arrived. This one unexpected. Not from the media. Not from advisors. From the hospital. A development related to the accident that had been considered minor at first, now demanding closer examination. The tone was calm, but the implication was serious. Serious enough to change plans. Serious enough to raise new questions. Harry listened, expression unreadable, as the details were explained. This wasn't a crisis, but it wasn't nothing. And it meant the story wasn't done evolving. Not yet. He nodded, thanked them, and sat back. The clarity he'd felt earlier wavered. Not because he regretted speaking, but because he understood now. The accident had opened a door. Speaking had widened it. And what lay beyond that door was still unknown. As night fell once more, Harry found himself back in the same position. Waiting. But this time, not passively. This time, aware that the next turn in the story wouldn't be about words. It would be about what came next, and whether the fragile progress made under pressure could survive what was still unfolding. Because the past, stirred awake, was not done making itself known. And the next revelation would force everyone to reconsider what if the detail everyone dismissed turns out to be the one that changes everything? Because that's how it always happens. Not with a bang. Not with a shocking revelation announced from a podium. But with something small. Something technical. Something that sounds boring enough to ignore, until it isn't. The hospital update didn't arrive with urgency in its voice. It didn't trigger alarms or frantic movement. It was delivered calmly, professionally, wrapped in the kind of language designed to reassure rather than alarm. But reassurance, Harry had learned, often masks transition. This isn't an emergency. That was said clearly. But it does require further review. Those words landed harder than anyone expected. Because further review meant revisiting assumptions. It meant reopening conversations that had already been mentally closed. It meant admitting that the version of events everyone had settled into might not be complete. And incompleteness is dangerous, especially when the world is already watching. Harry listened carefully as the explanation unfolded. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden downturn. No sharp shift in condition. Just a reassessment of something that, in hindsight, maybe should have been examined more closely from the start. Sometimes the body doesn't reveal everything immediately. Sometimes shock hides symptoms. Sometimes the most important clues surface only after the adrenaline fades. These are ordinary medical realities. But nothing about this situation felt ordinary anymore. As the details were laid out, Harry felt that familiar tightening in his chest again. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. He had been here before. Not in a hospital bed, but in moments when narratives were prematurely declared settled, only to be reopened later with consequences no one had anticipated. The family was informed quickly, quietly, without dramatics. The reactions were controlled on the surface, but internally, something shifted. Again, because this update didn't just affect recovery timelines or medical plans. It threatened to reframe the entire story of the accident. If something had been underestimated at first, what else might have been overlooked? If assumptions had guided early interpretations, how solid were those interpretations now? Questions multiplied. Not loudly, relentlessly. Advisors recalibrated once more. This was becoming a pattern. Adjust, pause, reassess, move forward carefully, then repeat. But each repetition drained emotional reserves. You can only live in a state of near crisis for so long before it takes its toll. Harry felt it in his bones. Exhaustion layered on top of adrenaline, layered on top of emotional exposure. He wanted stability, something solid to stand on. But stability felt elusive, because even as the medical team spoke with calm confidence, the implications beyond the hospital walls loomed large. Would this require explanation? Would this invite new scrutiny? Would this validate the speculation that had already begun circulating? No one said it out loud, but everyone thought it. This changes the calculus. And the calculus wasn't just about health. It was about trust. Because the public, once it senses that information has evolved, rarely gives the benefit of the doubt. Evolution gets reframed as concealment. Clarification becomes contradiction. Harry understood that instinctively. He had lived through it. The family gathered again, though this time the mood was different. Less raw emotion. More fatigue. Less urgency. More concern. Concern is quieter. But it lingers longer. They spoke carefully, weighing each word. Not out of fear of each other, but out of awareness of how fragile the situation remained. One person voiced what everyone was thinking. We don't want this to spiral. Spiral was the right word. Because spirals don't require malicious intent. They only require momentum. And momentum was building again. Outside, the statement Harry had released continued to circulate. It was still being interpreted, praised, questioned. But now it existed alongside whispers of new developments. The two threads began to intertwine. Emotion and uncertainty. Humanity and suspicion. It's a volatile mix. Harry was briefed on the external temperature. Not in detail. Just enough to understand that interest hadn't faded. It had shifted. The questions were no longer just about how he felt. They were about what really happened. And once that shift occurs, it's hard to reverse. Because people don't like ambiguity. They want clean stories. Heroes and villains. Clear timelines. Definitive conclusions. But real life rarely offers those. Especially not in moments like this. Harry felt torn between two impulses. One was to retreat. To focus on healing. To let professionals handle the rest. The other was to stay engaged. To remain present in the unfolding narrative, even as it grew more complex. Both impulses felt justified. Both carried risks. He thought again about the hospital room. The fragile connection. The sense that something meaningful had been reclaimed. Would that survive another wave of pressure? Or would it buckle under the weight of renewed uncertainty? No one had answers. And the absence of answers felt heavier than before. As plans were adjusted to account for the new medical review, something else quietly changed. The timeline. What had been expected to resolve within a certain window now extended. Not dramatically, but enough to disrupt expectations. Disrupted expectations are dangerous in public narratives. They invite interpretation. They invite comparison. They invite doubt. Harry noticed the shift in how people spoke around him. Still respectful. Still professional. But with an added layer of caution. He was no longer just recovering. He was under observation. Not just medically. Narratively. That realization brought a wave of frustration. Not because he felt misunderstood, but because he felt trapped in a story that refused to let him simply exist as a person in recovery. Every update carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. Every decision rippled outward. Even rest felt strategic. As evening approached again, the family faced another decision point, smaller than the last. Less drama,